It was a quiet morning in the city courthouse. The sun shone through the large glass windows, falling across the wooden benches where people sat waiting for their cases to be heard. The air was filled with tension, the sound of papers shuffling and footsteps echoing against marble floors. Lawyers whispered to their clients and reporters adjusted their cameras, ready to capture whatever headline might come out of the day's hearings. In the middle of all that noise stood a man named Marcus Reed. He was tall, calm, and dressed in a dark blue suit. His expression was serious but peaceful, his hands resting loosely in front of him. People looked at him with curiosity because he didn't look nervous, not even a bit. His calmness almost confused them. To the guards standing near the judge's bench, he looked like just another defendant, someone waiting to be judged. But there was something different about him, something in his eyes that didn't match the way he was being treated. When Judge Henry Wallace entered the courtroom, everyone stood. The judge was an older man, known for being strict and hard on people who appeared in his courtroom. He didn't like excuses, didn't like delays, and certainly didn't like anyone he thought was wasting his time. As he sat down, his robe settled around him like a symbol of authority. The bailiff called out, "Case number 47, State versus Marcus Reed." Every head turned toward Marcus. Some whispered surprise that a man so well-dressed could be in trouble. Others leaned in, eager to hear what the case was about. Judge Wallace adjusted his glasses and stared down at Marcus, his tone cold. "Mr. Reed," he said, "you stand accused of obstructing an investigation. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Marcus looked up at him and spoke gently. "No, Your Honor. I believe this is a misunderstanding." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated sharply. "That's what everyone says when they're caught. I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I've heard that excuse too many times." The crowd murmured. The judge continued to speak, his voice echoing through the hall. "You people think you can walk into my courtroom and waste our time with stories. But not today. This court will not tolerate lies or arrogance." Marcus didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was calm, polite, and completely without anger. That calmness seemed to bother the judge even more. As the prosecutor began reading the supposed charges, Marcus stood quietly, listening. The papers described a situation that didn't make much sense, that Marcus had failed to provide evidence in a federal case. But those who looked closely could see something was off. The details were vague, the accusations confusing. It sounded like a clerical mix-up, but no one said anything. After all, in that room, the judge's word was final. Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mr. Reed, I've seen cases like yours before. People who think they're above the law. People who think their status or education will protect them. You're not special. You've wasted this court's time, and that comes with consequences." Still, Marcus remained silent. The courtroom was so quiet now that you could hear the ticking of the clock above the judge's bench. A young intern sitting in the corner frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. She whispered to the person beside her, "Why doesn't he have a lawyer speaking for him?" The man beside her shrugged. "Maybe he couldn't afford one," he replied. But Marcus looked nothing like a man who couldn't afford a lawyer. Finally, the judge asked, "Do you have anyone to represent you, Mr. Reed?" Marcus smiled faintly. "No, Your Honor. I thought I'd handle it myself." The judge chuckled dryly. "Of course you did," he said. "You think you're smarter than everyone else in this room." Marcus didn't reply. He just looked at the judge with calm eyes, eyes that held no anger, only patience. The hearing went on for nearly an hour. Witnesses were called, but none seemed to know Marcus personally. The papers presented didn't match his identity perfectly, but still, the judge pressed forward. It was as if he had already made up his mind before the hearing began. The tension in the courtroom grew heavier. When the time came for the judge to give his decision, everyone braced for it. Judge Wallace looked down at Marcus and said, "It's clear to me that you've disrespected this court and tried to manipulate the system. I will be recommending a harsh penalty." A woman in the audience gasped. "But he didn't even get a fair hearing," she whispered. Marcus stood perfectly still. He didn't flinch, didn't protest. He simply took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said softly. The judge blinked, surprised. "Did you just thank me?" he asked. "Yes," Marcus replied, "for reminding me that we all have to answer for what we believe in." His words carried a weight that no one quite understood. The judge frowned but didn't respond. He tapped his gavel once, signaling a brief recess before sentencing. The courtroom began to buzz with noise again. People turned to each other, confused. Some said Marcus was brave. Others said he was foolish. But one thing was certain, everyone felt uneasy. Something didn't fit. As Marcus sat quietly, the young intern from earlier couldn't stop watching him. She noticed the way he carried himself. Not like a guilty man, but like someone waiting for something important to be revealed. She leaned toward her supervisor and whispered, "Sir, can you check his case file again? Something's wrong here." The supervisor shrugged. "It's not our job to interfere with the judge's decision," he said. Meanwhile, Marcus took out a small notebook from his pocket and began writing something down. His handwriting was neat and steady. When the bailiff asked what he was doing, Marcus smiled and said, "Just making notes for later. I might need them." The bailiff didn't understand, but something about Marcus's calmness made him uneasy. He had seen hundreds of people come through that courtroom, angry, scared, desperate, but never someone like this man, who looked as if he was watching a movie of his own life and already knew how it would end. When the judge returned, he cleared his throat and looked even sterner than before. He announced that he was ready to give the final sentence. Marcus stood again, straight and composed. Reporters lifted their pens, ready to write down the next headline. Judge Wallace began, "Marcus Reed for the obstruction of a federal investigation. This court sentences you to..." But before he could finish, Marcus raised his hand slightly. "Your Honor," he said politely, "before you continue, may I ask one question?" The judge hesitated. "You may," he said impatiently. Marcus smiled faintly and said, "Are you certain you have the right Marcus Reed?" The judge frowned. "What are you implying?" Marcus didn't answer directly. "Just that mistakes happen sometimes, even in courtrooms," he said quietly. The judge's face hardened. "I don't make mistakes," he said sharply. "Especially not with people like you." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "I understand, Your Honor. Thank you for your honesty." His tone wasn't sarcastic, and it was sincere. But those words made the judge uncomfortable, as if Marcus knew something he didn't. When the gavel came down again, the sound echoed like thunder. The courtroom clerk began typing up the official papers. Marcus looked around at the faces staring at him, some angry, some confused, some sad. He took another slow breath, his eyes calm as ever. He whispered to himself, "Sometimes silence teaches louder than words." And as the guards moved to escort him away, no one in that courtroom realized that within minutes, everything they thought they knew about this man, and about justice, would completely change. The sound of the gavel still echoed when Marcus was led toward the holding area. The courtroom audience slowly dispersed, but the air remained heavy with confusion. Many couldn't understand what had just happened. A man who carried himself with quiet confidence had just been given one of the harshest sentences they'd seen for a charge that didn't even seem clear. Some whispered that maybe he really was guilty. Others said it all felt wrong. Marcus walked calmly beside the two guards. They noticed he didn't resist, didn't complain. One of them, a young officer named Daniels, glanced at him and said softly, "Sir, I'm sorry about what happened in there." Marcus smiled kindly and replied, "You have nothing to be sorry for. You're just doing your job." His calmness unsettled even the guard. Most people leaving that courtroom were angry, crying, or shouting. But Marcus walked as if he knew this wasn't the end of his story. In the courtroom, Judge Wallace sat alone for a moment after everyone left. He rubbed his forehead and sighed. Something about the case didn't sit right with him, but his pride wouldn't let him question his own decision. He had built a reputation as a no-nonsense judge, someone who never backed down, but deep down a small voice whispered that maybe he had judged too quickly. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, a woman named Claire Jennings hurried through the crowd. She was a senior attorney for the Federal Prosecution Office, carrying a folder full of papers. Her face was pale as she looked around, trying to find someone. "Where's Marcus Reed?" she asked the clerk urgently. The clerk looked at his schedule and said, "Courtroom 3. He just got sentenced." Claire froze. "Sentenced?" she repeated. "That's impossible." She started running toward the courtroom. The sound of her heels echoed loudly on the floor. Reporters turned their heads as she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The judge was still gathering his papers when she shouted, "Your Honor, stop, there's been a serious mistake." Judge Wallace looked up sharply, annoyed. "This is a court of law, young lady," he said sternly. "You cannot burst in like that." "Then please forgive my manners," she said, breathing heavily. "But you just sentenced the wrong man." The judge frowned. "What are you talking about?" Claire walked closer and placed a thick folder on his desk. "Marcus Reed is not the defendant in that case. He's the lead federal prosecutor assigned to appear before you today on a corruption hearing." For a moment, the courtroom went completely silent. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to stop. The judge blinked. "That's not possible," he said slowly. "The name on the docket was Marcus Reed." "Yes," Claire replied, her voice trembling with urgency, "because someone in clerical processing switched the case files by mistake. The real defendant's name is Martin Reed, not Marcus Reed. You punished the wrong man." The color drained from the judge's face. He reached for the file on his desk and quickly flipped through it. His hands trembled slightly as he compared the ID number. There it was, a simple typo, one wrong letter in a last name. His throat went dry. "Get the guards," he said quickly. "Bring him back here. Now." Back in the hallway, Marcus stood near the security desk, waiting patiently. When the guards received the order, Daniels looked surprised. "They want you back in court, sir." Marcus gave a soft smile. "I was wondering how long it would take." When he walked back in, the judge couldn't look him in the eye. The courtroom doors opened again, and everyone who had been leaving started returning, whispering in disbelief. The reporters were scribbling notes furiously. Claire stood beside Marcus and said, "Your Honor, this man is my colleague. He's one of the most respected federal prosecutors in our department. He came here today to oversee a hearing, not to stand trial." The judge swallowed hard. "Mr. Reed, he began, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "There has been a terrible mistake." Marcus nodded calmly. "I figured as much." "I owe you an apology," the judge said quietly. "This was not supposed to happen." Marcus looked at him kindly. "Your Honor, it's not the first time someone has been judged before being understood," he said. Those words hit the room like thunder. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment. The judge's shoulders slumped as guilt washed over him. He had spoken down to Marcus, doubted his integrity, and handed him a sentence without truly checking the facts. One of the clerks whispered, "How could we miss something so obvious?" The judge rubbed his forehead again, his voice shaking now. "Mr. Reed, I don't even know where to begin," Marcus replied softly. "Start with fairness, Your Honor. That's all any of us can ask for." Claire stepped in. "This error must be corrected immediately. His record should be cleared and an official statement made." The judge nodded quickly. "Yes, of course, everything will be corrected. I take full responsibility." But Marcus didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. "Your Honor, do you know how many people come through this courtroom who never get a chance to speak, who are judged only by how they look or sound?" The judge stayed silent. Marcus continued gently. "Today I stood there quietly because I wanted to see how fast the world makes decisions without asking questions. Now I have my answer." There was a long pause. The young intern who had doubted the case earlier wiped a tear from her eye. The truth of Marcus's words sank deep into everyone in the room. After a moment, Marcus said, "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. Mistakes happen, but maybe today can be a reminder for all of us. Justice without understanding isn't justice at all." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes full of regret. For once he had no clever reply, no lecture to give. He looked like a man who had just seen a reflection of himself he didn't like. Outside the courtroom, the story spread fast. Reporters rushed to publish the news. The headlines were powerful. "Judge mistakenly sentences federal prosecutor. Learns a lesson on fairness." People across the city began talking about it. Some were angry at the system, while others were moved by Marcus's calm grace in the face of unfair treatment. But for Marcus, fame was not what mattered. As he walked out of the courthouse that day, the sun hit his face again, the same way it had in the morning. He took a deep breath and smiled faintly. The same guard, Daniels, followed him to the door and said quietly, "Sir, I've never seen anyone handle something like that the way you did." Marcus turned to him and said, "We can't control how people see us, but we can control how we respond. That's where true power lies." Daniels nodded slowly, his respect for Marcus clear in his eyes. Inside the courtroom, Judge Wallace sat in silence long after everyone had gone. The once proud man now felt humbled. He looked around at the empty benches and whispered to himself, "How many times have I spoken before listening?" He closed the file, his hands trembling slightly, and looked toward the American flag hanging beside his bench. "Justice must never forget mercy," he murmured. Later that evening, Marcus returned to his office. His colleagues gathered around him, worried and angry about what he had gone through. But Marcus only said, "Don't blame the judge. The system is built by people, and people can learn. What matters is that we keep trying to make it better." His assistant asked, "Are you going to file a complaint?" Marcus smiled. "No. I think today's lesson was already powerful enough." That night, when he sat alone by his window, watching the city lights flicker, Marcus thought about the faces he'd seen in court, the fearful, the forgotten, the misunderstood. He realized how easily justice could be lost when people forget compassion, and he promised himself that from that day forward, he would fight not only for truth, but also for understanding. When Marcus arrived at his office the next morning, the place was already buzzing. Reporters had been calling since dawn, and the front desk was filled with flashing cameras and microphones. Everyone wanted a comment from the wrongly accused prosecutor. Marcus quietly walked through the crowd, nodding politely but not stopping. His assistant Emma met him at the door, looking both relieved and anxious. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, following him into his office. "I'm fine, Emma," he said, setting his briefcase down. "A misunderstanding doesn't define who I am," she frowned. "But what happened yesterday was unfair. The whole city is talking about it." Marcus gave a small smile. "Maybe that's good. Sometimes the world needs to see how fast judgment can turn into injustice." He sat down at his desk, opened a file, and began reading quietly. His calmness confused everyone. Most people would have been furious, but Marcus had something different in mind. He wasn't looking for revenge, he wanted reflection. Later that day, an unexpected visitor arrived at his office. Judge Wallace himself stood at the door holding his hat in his hands. The security officer at the entrance hesitated, unsure if he should announce him, but Marcus looked up and said gently, "Let him in." The judge entered slowly, his posture humble, his face showing exhaustion and guilt. "Mr. Reed," he began, "I owe you more than an apology. I came to say it face to face." Marcus stood up and offered him a chair. "You didn't have to come, Your Honor," he said softly. The judge sighed. "Yes, I did. Yesterday I saw something in myself that I didn't like. I saw a man who had become too comfortable sitting above others, thinking he understood people by just looking at them." Marcus nodded silently, letting him speak. "I read your profile last night," the judge continued, his voice cracking slightly. "You've prosecuted some of the toughest corruption cases in this state. You've stood up against people far more dangerous than me, and yet, when you stood in my courtroom, I didn't see any of that. I just saw a man I thought fit a pattern I'd made in my mind." Marcus looked at him kindly. "We all do that sometimes, Your Honor. We see what's familiar, not what's true." The judge shook his head. "That's not an excuse. My duty was to be fair, and I failed. I spoke to the court committee this morning. I'm requesting a full review of my conduct." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," Wallace said firmly. "If a man in my position can make such a careless judgment, then it means something in the system is broken, and it starts with me." Marcus studied him for a long moment before replying softly, "Then maybe yesterday wasn't a mistake." "Your Honor, maybe it was a lesson." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "You could have destroyed me publicly, Marcus. The world would have sided with you. But instead, you chose grace." "Why?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Because if I react with anger, I prove the system right about its assumptions. But if I react with understanding, I help it heal." The judge sat back, speechless. There was something deeply moving in Marcus's words. They didn't come from pride or superiority, but from deep wisdom, the kind learned through years of watching how the world treats people differently based on appearances. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When the judge left, he shook Marcus's hand firmly. "You've taught me something I'll never forget," he said quietly. "From now on, I'll start every case with one thought: listen first." That evening, Marcus went for a walk through the city. The streets were still busy, the air filled with car horns and chatter. He passed by the courthouse where everything had happened the day before. The tall columns looked the same, but to him they carried a new meaning now. Justice wasn't just about laws and books. It was about humanity, the ability to see beyond surface and title. He walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench watching children play. Their laughter filled the air, innocent and free. A little boy tripped and fell, and another ran over to help him up without hesitation. Marcus smiled softly. "That's how it should be," he whispered. "We fall, we help each other rise." As the sun began to set, his phone buzzed. It was Claire, his colleague. "Marcus, the news stations want an interview. They want to know what you'll say about the judge." He thought for a moment, then answered, "Tell them I have nothing bad to say. Just tell them I believe we can all learn to be better." Claire was quiet for a second. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," Marcus said. "If I turn this into anger, then I become part of the problem." That night, his words aired on the evening news. Reporters quoted him. "We must remember that justice is not a performance, it's an act of understanding." The quote spread fast. People shared it online, repeating his message of patience and empathy. Some said Marcus reminded them of what fairness truly meant. Others said he gave them hope that change was possible, even in a broken system. A week later, Judge Wallace invited Marcus to speak at a judicial ethics seminar attended by hundreds of lawyers and judges. When Marcus took the stage, the room fell silent. He wasn't an angry man demanding apologies. He was a calm voice asking for awareness. He began softly. "Yesterday I was called a criminal by mistake. Today I stand here not to accuse, but to remind us all that mistakes can also open eyes." He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of many who had once thought like the judge. Every day, thousands of people walk into courtrooms across this country. Some are guilty, some are not. But before the verdict, they are all human. Let's start there. The audience listened quietly, many nodding in reflection. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. Marcus continued, "Justice without compassion becomes pride, and pride without reflection leads to blindness. We don't need perfect judges or lawyers. We need honest ones who are willing to see beyond assumptions." When he finished, the audience stood and applauded. The judge, sitting in the front row, had tears in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt inspired again, not by law, but by humanity. After the speech, reporters asked Marcus why he didn't sue the court for the mistake. He replied with a small smile, "Because change born from anger fades. Change born from understanding lasts." Days later, Judge Wallace officially introduced a new policy in his court. Every case would begin with a pause moment, giving both sides a chance to be fully heard before any judgment or comment was made. Other judges began to adopt the same practice, calling it the Reed Principle. The story didn't just fade away as news usually does. It became a lesson that law students studied, a moral story shared in seminars and classrooms. One evening, Marcus received a handwritten letter at his office. It was from Judge Wallace. It read, "Dear Marcus, you reminded me that justice isn't about being right. It's about being fair. I was once proud of my sharp words and quick decisions. Now I'm proud of my silence before I speak. Thank you for teaching me that." Marcus folded the letter gently and placed it inside his desk drawer. He didn't show it to anyone. Some things he believed were meant to stay private, as personal reminders that even the hardest hearts can change when given grace instead of anger. As the night deepened, Marcus looked out the window of his office at the city lights below. He whispered to himself, maybe that's what true justice is, giving people the chance to become better than their mistakes. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the courthouse had ever seen. The story of Marcus Reed and Judge Wallace had spread far beyond the city. Newspapers, television channels, and online platforms everywhere shared it as an example of humility and grace. Some called it the day justice looked in the mirror. Others simply called it the Reed case. Inside the courthouse, things began to change quietly. The atmosphere that had once been cold and mechanical started to feel a little more human. Clerks spoke more gently to visitors, officers showed more patience, and even lawyers who were used to rushing cases began to listen more carefully. It wasn't a law that changed them. It was the memory of one man who stayed calm in the face of injustice. Judge Wallace had changed the most. The man who once spoke in hard tones now started his day differently. He arrived earlier, sat alone in his empty courtroom for 10 minutes each morning, and reflected before beginning any hearing. His assistant once found him staring at the empty seats and asked, "Sir, are you all right?" He smiled faintly and said, "Yes. I'm just learning to listen before I speak." That one habit became known as his moment of silence. Every day before the first trial, he would close his eyes for a few seconds, reminding himself of Marcus Reed's calm face standing in that same courtroom. Meanwhile, Marcus went back to his daily work at the federal office. Though his routine hadn't changed much, his presence carried new weight. Younger attorneys came to him for advice not just about legal arguments, but about how to handle pressure, mistakes, and unfairness. One afternoon, a young lawyer named Daniel knocked on Marcus's door. He looked nervous, holding a file tightly in his hands. "Sir, do you have a minute?" he asked. Marcus gestured for him to sit. "Of course. What's the matter?" Daniel hesitated. "I made a mistake in a case last week. A big one. It might cost an innocent man his freedom. I came here because I don't know what to do." Marcus listened quietly, then said softly, "The first thing to do is tell the truth. Don't hide it. Mistakes don't destroy us, and denying them does." Daniel looked down ashamed. "But I'll lose my job," Marcus shook his head. "Maybe, but you'll keep something more important, your integrity." The young man nodded slowly, and tears filled his eyes. "I've read about what you went through, sir. I guess I wanted to be brave like you." Marcus smiled gently. "Bravery isn't about never being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are." That small talk became another quiet lesson that spread through the department. People started calling Marcus the Calm Fire, because his strength didn't come from shouting or anger, but from the quiet way he changed people's hearts. One day, a letter arrived from the National Association of Judges, inviting Marcus to speak at their annual conference. It was a rare honor, the kind usually reserved for high-ranking officials or famous legal scholars. Marcus hesitated at first. He didn't see himself as a hero, but Claire encouraged him. "Marcus, people listen to you differently now," she said. "You're not just a lawyer anymore. You're a voice for fairness." A few weeks later, Marcus stood on a large stage in front of hundreds of judges, attorneys, and students. Cameras flashed, lights shone, and the room went silent as he stepped up to the microphone. He took a deep breath and began, "I am not here to talk about laws or punishment. I am here to talk about the people behind those laws, the ones we sometimes forget to see." He told them about that day in court, not to shame the judge, but to remind everyone that justice is fragile when pride takes over. "When I stood there," he said softly, "I realized something. We live in a world that moves too fast to ask questions, but fairness only lives where patience exists. That's true not just in law, but in life." As he spoke, the audience sat in complete silence. Some judges nodded slowly, their faces showing deep reflection. Marcus continued, "The judge who sentenced me came back to apologize. That day I saw that even people in power can change when they choose to listen." When he finished, there was a long pause before the room burst into applause. Many people stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Even Judge Wallace, who was sitting quietly in the back row, joined in. For him, it wasn't just applause, it was gratitude. After the event, the judge approached Marcus once again. "You've become something of a legend," he said with a gentle laugh. Marcus smiled. "Legends are stories, Your Honor. I'm just a man who learned to stay calm when life wasn't fair." Wallace looked at him with respect. "You changed me, Marcus. And not just me. You reminded all of us that the robe we wear doesn't make us wise. Humility does." Their friendship grew stronger after that. Sometimes they met for coffee in a small cafe near the courthouse. People often stared, surprised to see a judge and a prosecutor laughing together. But they didn't care. For them, every conversation was another step toward healing the gap between judgment and understanding. One rainy evening, as they sat by the window, Marcus said quietly, Do you ever think about how different things could have been that day? The judge nodded. Every single night. But I've stopped wishing to erase it. If that day hadn't happened, I might never have learned to see beyond the surface. Marcus smiled softly. That's the beauty of mistakes. When handled with honesty, they turn into lessons. The next morning, Judge Wallace held court again. This time he looked at the people standing before him. A nervous teenager, a tired mother, an old man accused of something minor. And he saw not cases, but lives. His tone was gentler now. His decisions were still fair and firm, but they carried understanding. Reporters who once called him the Iron Judge now described him as the judge with a heart. Outside the courtroom, Marcus's quiet influence continued. He started a mentorship program for young law students, teaching them not only how to argue cases but how to see people with empathy. He often told them, "Your words can build or break someone's future. Choose them as if your own life depends on them, because someone's always does." One afternoon, as he finished a lecture, a student asked, "Mr. Reed, how did you stay calm when everyone treated you unfairly?" Marcus smiled gently. "Because anger blinds, but patience reveals the truth. The judge didn't see me for who I was, but I saw him. A man trapped in his own fear of being wrong. So instead of hating him, I gave him the one thing fear can't handle: respect." The room was silent for a moment before everyone began to clap. Marcus nodded humbly and said, "Now it's your turn to carry that lesson." That night, back in his quiet apartment, Marcus sat by his window, sipping tea and watching the city lights. He thought about the journey, from standing accused in a courtroom to becoming a voice of change. He never wanted fame. He only wanted fairness. Somewhere in another part of the city, Judge Wallace did the same, sitting alone, reflecting on the day's trials. On his desk was a small photo of his family and a single quote written on paper: "Understand before you judge." Both men, different in position but equal in purpose, had learned something rare: that forgiveness and fairness could walk hand in hand. As time passed, others began to follow their example. Law students quoted Marcus's words. Judges paused before sentencing. Even police officers began community workshops to learn empathy. In their daily work, it all started with one mistake, one moment of misunderstanding that could have destroyed two lives, but instead built a bridge between them, and in that quiet transformation, both Marcus and the judge found something greater than victory or justice. They found peace. Months passed and life slowly returned to normal for everyone at the courthouse. But something had changed permanently. The people who worked there carried a quiet awareness, a memory that reminded them to look twice, to listen before judging, and to speak with care. The story of Marcus Reed was no longer just a courtroom mistake. It had become a symbol of awakening, a story shared in classrooms, meetings, and homes across the nation. Marcus himself never talked much about what had happened. He preferred to focus on his work. But wherever he went, people recognized him. Some wanted to shake his hand. Others wanted to thank him for speaking with kindness when he could have chosen anger. He always smiled politely and said the same thing: "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them." One morning, as Marcus prepared for a new corruption case, his assistant Emma walked in holding a thick envelope. "Sir," she said with a smile, "this came for you." Marcus opened it and found dozens of handwritten letters from people around the country. Some were from law students, others from ordinary citizens. One letter stood out. It was from a man in a small town who had been wrongly accused of a crime years ago. He wrote, "When I read your story, I cried. I thought no one understood what it feels like to be judged unfairly. But now I know there are good people in the system. People like you. You gave me hope." Marcus sat silently for a while after reading that letter. He looked out the window, watching the people below rushing through their morning routines. He realized that even if he never won another case, he had already changed something far more important: the way people thought about justice. Around that same time, Judge Wallace was also changing lives in his own way. His courtroom had become known for fairness and empathy. Reporters no longer came to find drama or harsh sentences. Instead, they came to witness how compassion could exist inside the walls of justice. One article even titled him, "The Reformed Judge Who Found His Humanity." One afternoon, he invited a group of young judges to his office for a private meeting. They expected a lecture on legal rules, but instead he told them a story. He said, there was once a man who stood before me, calm, patient, and wrongfully accused. I sentenced him without listening. And that day I realized I wasn't judging his actions. I was judging my own assumptions. The young judges listened quietly, moved by his honesty. The oldest among them asked softly, "What did you do afterward?" The judge smiled faintly. I asked him to forgive me, and he did. That forgiveness taught me more about law than any book ever could. Those words spread among the new judges like wildfire. They began to apply the same principle in their own courts, to understand before judging. Slowly, across the state, the system began to change, not because of new rules, but because of a shift in heart. Meanwhile, Marcus's mentorship program for law students kept growing. He didn't teach them only about laws or arguments. He taught them about people, the human stories behind every file, every case, every name. He often said, "You can know every law in the world, but if you forget to see the person standing before you, you've already lost the case." His students adored him. They called him Professor Calm, a name that made him laugh every time he heard it. He didn't see himself as a teacher, but as a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands tall and quiet. One day, Marcus was invited to a television interview about his journey. The host asked, "Mr. Reed, after all that happened, do you ever wish you had reacted differently?" Marcus smiled softly. "No," he said. "If I had shouted or argued that day, people would have remembered my anger. But because I stayed silent, they remembered the truth. Silence can be powerful when it carries dignity." The audience applauded. Many at home felt tears in their eyes, inspired by his calm voice and gentle confidence. After the show, Marcus received a message from Judge Wallace. It said, "You handled that perfectly, my friend. The world needs more people like you." Marcus smiled as he read it. The friendship between the two men had grown into something like family. They often shared letters, ideas, and reflections. In a world divided by status and pride, their bond was a symbol that understanding could bridge any gap. A few weeks later, Marcus visited a community center to give a talk about fairness. The hall was filled with young people, some studying law, others just curious about his story. As he spoke, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Sir, how do you forgive someone who hurt you deeply?" Marcus looked at her for a moment and said gently, "Forgiveness doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means you choose peace over pain. You let go not for them, but for yourself." The hall grew quiet. Many nodded, understanding his words in their own way. Later that evening, as Marcus left the center, an elderly man stopped him near the exit. His eyes were moist as he said, "Thank you, son. You reminded me that goodness still lives in people." Marcus smiled and shook his hand. "It always does, sir. Sometimes it just needs a little light to be seen." Back at the courthouse, Judge Wallace was preparing to retire. After 4 decades on the bench, he had decided it was time to let younger judges continue the work. On his final day, the courtroom was filled with familiar faces: attorneys, clerks, officers, and even some of the people he had once judged. Before leaving, he gave a short speech. His voice was steady but full of emotion. "I spent many years believing justice was about power," he said. "But one man taught me it's about humility. He taught me that every case that comes before us is a mirror, and what we see in it depends on who we are inside." The crowd applauded softly, some wiping their eyes. When the ceremony ended, he stepped down from the bench one last time. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was waiting. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Marcus said with a warm smile. The judge laughed quietly. "I was hoping you'd come." They walked together down the courthouse steps side by side. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. It felt symbolic, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. As they reached the street, Judge Wallace turned to Marcus. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "if someone had told me that the man I wrongly sentenced would one day become my closest friend, I wouldn't have believed it." Marcus chuckled softly. "Life has a strange way of teaching us what we need to learn," the judge nodded. "And sometimes the lesson comes from the person we least expect." They shook hands one last time. The judge went home to begin his peaceful retirement, and Marcus continued his mission, working quietly to build a fairer system, one heart at a time. Years later, when new law students studied ethics and justice, their textbooks included a small chapter titled The Reed Lesson. It told the story of a courtroom mistake that changed two men forever, one through humility and the other through grace. The final paragraph of that chapter read, "Justice is not about winning or losing. It is about understanding. The strongest man is not the one who speaks loudest, but the one who stays calm enough to listen." In his office, Marcus kept the letter from the wrongly accused man on his desk. Whenever he faced a difficult case or a moral decision, he would read it again to remind himself why he did what he did. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about that morning when everything could have gone wrong, when he stood accused before a man who didn't know him. And each time he felt grateful, not bitter, because that day had turned his life into something larger than himself. He had shown the world that silence, grace, and understanding could rewrite the story of justice. And somewhere, far from the courthouse noise and bright lights, a retired judge sat on his porch watching the sunset, whispering the same words Marcus once said to him, "Understand before you judge." The story of Marcus Reed and Judge Wallace lived on, not as a scandal but as a light, reminding everyone that fairness begins in the heart, and that one act of patience can change the world more than 1,000 words ever could.